Berlin would like to welcome you to Taking the Essence, Turning the Mind Towards the Dharma, the Importance of the Small Scope. I'd like to introduce Venerable Dondrup. He is our center manager and SPC.
Hello, welcome. So, yeah, just on behalf of the center, just want to welcome Daryl to the community as a new teacher for us. Daryl has his master's degree in Buddhist philosophy from Maitripa, so he's an FPMT credentialed teacher, discovering Buddhism level, so he's highly qualified to take us through these contemplations, this understanding of this material. So we're just really grateful that he was able to accept our invitation, and we hope that it's just the beginning of classes, going into the future with Daryl. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you both, Venerable Dundrup and Shela. I'm excited to explore these topics a little bit with all of you and whomever it is that's able to show up and participate. And yeah, I have visited the center once. I think I was in Santa Fe at one point, and didn't attend any teachings or anything like that. But it was nice to see the space and enjoy some moments in the high desert. So a little different than Portland, where I live at this time. So
it's all renovated now, so you'll have to.
Oh, it's excellent. Totally. I mean, I didn't see a need for renovation then, but but this is a few years ago, so I don't question that they needed to be done. But yeah, that's great. I do aspire to make it in northern New Mexico again in the relatively near future. So. So to begin here this evening, let's just go ahead and take a couple moments. We'll do just a little bit of a centering meditation for ourselves and to be able to connect with our own motivation. And then when we come out of that, we'll do the refuge and bodhicitta prayers. And then I'll start introducing my approach to this topic, or how I kind of want to get us going with it. So find a comfortable seat, whatever that might be for you. And consciously bring your awareness into your own space. And consciously releasing some of the connections that draw our minds out of our presence with the Dharma and our practice with the Dharma. And bring to mind whatever your personal motivation for practicing is, here and now today. And in order to bring about that result, so in order to affect our intention, we can integrate that with the refuge and bodhicitta prayers and all of our activities in this Zoom meeting today. So we can do refuge and bodhicitta prayers. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. We'll come back to that in a few moments here. So I was happy to receive the first email from Venerable Dundrup asking about whether I could lead this class on the small scope and particularly trying to highlight the importance of it. So let's see what can come from that together. So as you all know, Buddhism is a tradition of a spiritual tradition that focuses on training our minds, right? So the function of Buddhist practice is to actualize our positive potential through generating both clear knowledge of the way that things exist and through generating spontaneous, limitless compassion. We often will recite the refuge and bodhicitta prayer just like we did at the beginning of our practice sessions and at Dharma talks. So part of that prayer is, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. And, often we can recite that, but we sometimes lose the actual meaning. We lose the connection with what those words are and what they're meant to be. So if we really mean, may I become a Buddha, then we must consistently engage in creating the causes and conditions for that result to come about. So the tradition is very clear, like, becoming a Buddha isn't just something that kind of miraculously happens. It's something that is actually brought about through generating the causes and conditions for it. It's very, on the one hand, that's a very empowering thing. On the other hand, it's also a daunting thing because like the responsibility is really ours. So, it's like, oh, like, yes, I can do this, but oh, yes, I have to do it. So it's this, really kind of fun blend of responsibility. So may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Also in that prayer is through my practice. Well, in the version that we just recited, it was through through the merits that I create through listening to the Dharma. There's another version of the prayer that says through my practice of giving and other perfections. So the giving is generosity. It's one of the 6 paramitas. So through the merit that I generate, through that activity of giving and all of the other perfections, for example, may I become a Buddha. And what through my practice of giving and other perfections is actually kind of saying, it's a little bit of shorthand for saying, may I perform each and every action that leads to the ripening of my own potential such that I can become a Buddha, right? That's kind of what's packed in that brief statement. I probably should put my standard disclaimer out there. I don't lead Dharma talks in a particularly traditional way. I do try to ground them in the tradition, but I also recognize that there is a bit of liability with that. So anything that I happen to say in this or any of the other Dharma talks, please don't hesitate to raise questions about that, or if you've heard something contrary or something that contradicts what I'm saying from a different teacher, particularly one that has like more experience and more study than I do, please use that as a basis for engaging with whatever it is that I'm saying. Because, while I have spent a bit of time with this material and these practices, I am a wanderer in samsara. So please do your own diligence and check up on the things that I'm articulating. And I have no problems with that. So basically, that comes up in my mind because I'm kind of encapsulating what I think is the meaning of through my practice of giving and other perfections, right? It's like, oh, that's shorthand for through my performing each and every single action that is needed in order for me to become a Buddha. Can I become a Buddha, right? So we can sometimes expand that. The prayer is like an encapsulation, right? But we can expand that, and we can think, through. And particularly in Lama Zopa Rinpoche style, can we integrate a lot of our daily activities so they're actually contributing to us becoming a Buddha, or having any particular realization that we're trying to have at a particular time? Like, how do we do that? How do we turn our lives into Dharma? So, to reintegrate this, through my practice of giving and other perfections, so through my practice of each and every activity that I participate in ideally every day, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit sentient beings, right? This is a quite beautiful and simple to consider. Kind of one way to encapsulate it would be like, okay, I'm going to do these things. I'm going to become a Buddha. I'm going to help others, and we're going to party on. It's like pretty sweet and pretty simple. The question becomes, what are all of those actions? What is it that we need to do in order to become a Buddha? And for that, we have a tremendous tradition to be able to rely on. There's a relatively clear delineation of the actions that we need to undertake in order to become a Buddha, in order to abandon the negativities that keep us bound in samsara and to actualize our positive potential. And keeping in the tradition of Thupten Norbu Ling and my Dharma home, which is my Tripa College, and grounded in the tradition of Tsongkhapa, who's a 14th and 15th century Tibetan scholar practitioner who founded the Gelug tradition. Among the many things that Tsongkhapa did, he spent a bit of time with the Stages of the Path literature. So Stages of the Path is the Lamrim, and the stages of the path are the actual stages of the path to enlightenment, right? So there's distinct activities and sections of that path and practice. So one of the major texts that he wrote on stages of the path in the Sutra tradition was the Lamrim Genmo, or the Great Treatise on the Stages of the Path to Enlightenment. And he based that text on Atisha's Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment, which articulated three scopes of practice, or three sort of levels of practitioners. There's different ways that people end up talking about it, but there were differentiated the small scope, or what sometimes people call the low scope, the medium scope, and the great scope. So and these scopes were differentiated by the practitioner's motivation, what they were trying to accomplish through their Dharma practice or through their spiritual practice. For the small scope, the range of that intention is to have a better rebirth. So that's the important thing for them. For a practitioner in the medium scope, it's recognizing the limitations of having better rebirths and really wanting to attain liberation from cyclic existence, or liberation from samsara. For the great scope, it's a matter of not only wanting to gain liberation from samsara, but then to be able to cultivate all of the positive potential of our mind, become a Buddha, and do that so we can be most effective at benefiting others. So in the great scope, we find this kind of unification of compassion and wisdom, compassion as the wish to free sentient beings from suffering, wisdom as one way to look at it is a sustained awareness that knows things as they are, which is arguably, I mean, there's lots of ways of talking about it, but arguably wisdom is the gateway for liberation from cyclic existence. It's a profound reorientation of the way that we see things and engage in the world. But it's important, so we get attracted to wisdom practice, we get attracted to compassion practice because, we see the effect that those things can have on our minds. However, if we jump into the great scope initially and we focus simply on those practices, we may find that there's a little bit more foundation that needs to be established, right? If compassion is something that's the wish to free sentient beings from suffering and its causes, but we don't have a really clear and deep awareness of how our lives are imbued with suffering, or if we don't recognize the liability of being born human and through the negative karma that we've created in this lifetime or potentially past lifetimes, if we don't recognize the liability of that, then the energy of the compassion that we can generate is not quite what it can be. So the Lama Tsongkhapa will talk about this in terms of the practices and teachings in the small and medium scope are in common with the great scope. So this is a matter of recognizing how the small scope practices and the small scope topics are actually integrated with the medium scope and great scope. So in the Lamrim Genmo, Lama Tsongkhapa says, I've given an explanation of the three types of persons. So that's the three scopes. However, the stages of the path for the person of great capacity also include the paths for the other two types of persons in their entirety. Thus, these two paths are parts or branches of the Mahayana path. So while we can be drawn to meditation on emptiness or the debate about the nature of reality, and we can be drawn to practices of generating loving kindness and compassion, we can be drawn to really trying to connect with and integrate the four immeasurables, for instance. But in order for us to really kind of get the deep realizations, we also need to spend a bit of time working through the path and practices of the small scope as well. So part of the request here and part of the motivation for me is to help motivate all of us to engage the path and practices of the small scope just a little bit more. That's assuming that you all have not already done all of that and eclipsed the realizations and you've got them perfectly integrated, which if you do, thank you for being present, because I'm sure that your presence here will help guide us all with this. So are there any thoughts or concerns, questions about what I've articulated thus far?
Aaron has raised his hand.
Oh, sorry. I'm actually, I should change my view. I'm just looking at myself right now.
So I'm sorry about coming in a little late, but one immediate question is how do we know that we're ready to start the next path? Like, is it a cognitive state that we acquire?
Yeah, that's a great question. And my initial reaction is I'd refer you to your close spiritual teacher, because they're the ones who are the best at giving guidance for this. However, in the Lamrim Genmo, and there are a variety of commentaries, they actually will articulate they'll describe the mind that is intended to arise from a particular practice. And, so you can develop some kind of sense of what that is, and then you can move forward. So that's one aspect of it. The other is while it is really important to integrate all of the practices and all of the teachings and all of the realizations of the path, I don't know that we have to do it so linearly, especially as kind of earlier and more beginning practitioners, right? Because whatever gives us energy and motivation in the practice is going to be really, really important, right? So, for me, having somebody like have to start at the very root, which is guru devotion in the Lamrim, for Westerners, it's like, well, is that the most practical and most effective method? And this is, again, you missed the caveat. I said, if I'm saying something that contradicts what more experienced, more realized, more learned teachers is saying, then please feel free to discard whatever it is that I'm saying, or use it as a foil to engage the material, right? So I personally am a firm believer that whatever it is that brings people into practice and whatever they want to spend time doing is going to be valid and worthwhile. It does become incumbent on us, either through our conversation with our spiritual community or our spiritual friends, our spiritual guides, that we round out our practice, and that's part of the point of this, right? It's like if we spend all our time on wisdom and compassion practice, but we haven't spent time really integrating our awareness of death and impermanence, for example, or our wish, for medium scope, our wish to get the heck out of samsara, then our ability to take the later practices of the great scope is a little bit diminished. So to come back around to what you're saying, on the one hand, use your spiritual mentor to help you make those determinations. Check that in relationship to what the texts will actually say about this is the mind. When you've done this practice, this is the realization that arises. This can be a conceptual realization, so we can have an idea where it's like, oh yeah, I actually get that, I understand that. But then we can also have some version of an experiential realization where we kind of know more deeply in our heart that's like, oh, that's really the way this is, or I can really feel that for the small scope, like I do have an incredible opportunity right now with this life that I have, with enough resources, with a Dharma community, with a teacher, with what all of the other, as they call them, leisures and opportunities. And then we can move on. But inevitably for us, maybe not inevitably, for most of us, we will work on a practice for a while, we'll gain some level of awareness and some level of kind of like familiarity with it, and then we'll move to do something else, and then we might find, oh, I need to come back to this and re-strengthen it. So I don't feel like practically speaking, we can move on at a particular time, but we also leave that space to come back to it open, have the humility that for now, this is what I've been able to do with this practice. And, based on the information I have, I can continue and move on. I know I talked a lot about that, but hopefully it touches on a couple things that make sense or are clear. Does that help you at all, Aaron?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, good. Yeah, so the practice of Dharma is, I don't know, for me, I read through the Lamrim, many times, and I'll read through it many times more, because from this tradition's perspective, it's a lifetime's long endeavor, right? It's not to say we can't be enlightened in this very lifetime, but for the majority of us, we have been cycling in samsara for a wee bit of time, and we can continue with it for a while longer. Not that we want to. We're not signing up to continue with samsara exactly, except from the the perspective of wanting to benefit others. That's kind of the only motivation that is worthwhile, or continue our spiritual development. Any other thoughts or curiosities? Okay. So, in keeping with what I was talking about, I may be taking a slightly unconventional approach to our discussion and our exploration of the small scope. There are lots of different ways that we can approach the path and practices of the small scope. One of them could be intellectually, where we go through, we read through the material, we just try to understand what's being said and think about it from sort of an academic level or academic curiosity. We could also just read through the text, multiple times. We could even memorize the text and just, gain that level of knowledge from it. As a practitioner, we could also just read an individual section and then start to integrate those practices as best we can and just work on it like that. But I would like to advocate a couple of things and then talk a little bit about how I'd like to explore approaching the small scope. So one of the things that's important to me is that we do the best we can to get clear on why it is that we're practicing Dharma and that we're focusing on the small scope in particular. So it's like, what do I intend, and what's my motivation? What am I looking for? What am I hoping to accomplish? And to get clear enough on that we can come back to it and either refine that a little bit, shift that a little bit, or enhance it a little bit, right? So the more clarity we have about that, the more directed our energy in the study and practice is going to be. And the more directed that can be, arguably can bring quicker or more profound results. So you may already have that, but maybe that's something that you can work with over the next couple of weeks. And maybe by the end of the course, it'd be great if you were able, at least personally, to articulate that. Like, oh yeah, this is what is driving my practice. That would be good. So another thing I want to kind of preface this module with is there are, and I don't know how long you all have been studying Dharma, but implicit in the teachings on the small scope are several assumptions or several aspects of a Buddhist worldview that for Westerners can be kind of foreign and a little bit challenging to integrate. So one of those things that's actually not challenging to integrate so much, but one of those aspects is, what we call Buddha nature, or our potential to eliminate every trace of negativity from our mental continuum and develop all positive qualities completely. That's a really profound thing, right? Each and every one of us, each and every sentient being, according to this tradition. I say that with the caveat that it's really important to come to actually understand that and recognize that. That is, particularly for Westerners, I think it can be something that really helps us to get past, or it kind of opens space in our tradition to be self-deprecating, or to be minimizing, or to not be confident in ourselves and being able to accomplish things. So the Buddha nature is the clear kind of knowing nature of mind, and it allows us to eliminate all traces of negativity and develop all of our positive qualities. Another aspect that the tradition assumes is continuity of consciousness, and that can be articulated in terms of rebirth, past and future lives, but the continuity of consciousness is also important because it gives us that potential to slowly over time transform and to develop exactly to develop exactly in the way that we want to. Kind of knit with that is another thing that they assume is karmic cause and effect. So we'll actually talk a bit more about karma later in this module, I hope. But karma is one of the things that's assumed. Also cyclic existence and the possibility of liberation and enlightenment, that's assumed as well. So I'm bringing those things up because inevitably in the small scope, we'll talk about some things that assume those perspectives. And if we're able to just let them rest on the table, rather than like completely disagreeing and saying, no, that can't be, or, oh, you know what, I don't believe in that, so the rest of what's being said doesn't make any sense, or, you know, I'm not going to spend any time with it. If we can let those things set on the table and say, okay, that's what the tradition is articulating. And if I don't ascribe to those things, is there still something that's valuable that I can learn from these teachings on precious human rebirth? Is there still something I can recognize sort of in my own activity that maps on or relates to or reflects the teachings on karma? So part of this is being able to walk this path between what the tradition is, where they're coming from, what they're articulating, but also being able to say, well, even if I don't ascribe to every single thing that's being expressed or articulated, there's still things of value that I can find in what is taught, right? Because that's the purpose of the tradition. I mean, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is very famous for and very well known for saying, you know, take what makes sense and what works for you and leave the rest. It's okay, you know. This is part of the non-dogmatic, the non-proselytizing aspect of the Dharma, right? It's like, you know, but because we come from, we as Westerners, again, there's an assumption I'm making about you all, that because as Westerners, like some of these ideas are really difficult to integrate, you know. But the point is, we don't necessarily have to integrate them perfectly initially to find something valuable in this stuff. So there's one more thing I want to talk about in terms of the approach that we're going to take, but I would like to, if there's some curiosity or kind of queasiness or any thoughts of the two things I've articulated, one in terms of the personal motivation, and two, these sort of like interacting with or engaging or recognizing the assumptions that are kind of packed into the Buddhist worldview that are either helpful or not so much. Anybody want to share anything about that? Okay. Oh, there's the hand. Now I'm seeing it. Yes, Jai.
So I actually come from a Tendai tradition, and I had a question about Buddha nature in the context of like the Tibetan. For my understanding of Buddha nature is that it is the aspect of the way that nirvana as unconditioned appears in samsara, and that's why we have the potential to become enlightened. Is that the same?
I don't often hear this tradition talk about it in exactly that way, but I don't know that it's utterly different. And you're asking a pretty technical point that I want to be careful not to misrepresent. Often the tradition will talk about it as the, for the Gelug tradition in particular, they'll talk about Buddha nature as the potential to become a fully enlightened Buddha. There's other Tibetan traditions that say we already are Buddhas, but the Gelug tradition is a little bit, they'll have some debate about that, right? And could you maybe articulate the Tendai tradition's perspective once more, just so I can hear that again?
Well, I think you answered it actually. So in the Tendai tradition, we already are enlightened. It's
Okay.
Hongaku. And the idea is that the reason why is because since nirvana is unconditioned, it is omnipresent.
Okay.
And therefore, like, it's really about realizing that state.
Yeah. The last part, the Gelug tradition would actually would articulate too, like I was saying earlier, it's like, oh, we want to do all of the practices to help us realize the nature of reality, to become a Buddha. Yeah, I mean, there's sometimes a discussion in the Tibetan traditions that the Gelug tradition is articulating things from the practice of, or from the perspective of being in samsara, where in order to be able to lead from that perspective, rather than taking the perspective of a fully enlightened being and then being able to articulate what we wandering in samsara appear like. No, it's like another aspect of the Buddha nature that the Gelug tradition definitely is going to highlight is the aspect of the mind, the nature of mind. And this is where it would probably get really technical about why it is that we don't recognize the potential of our mind, or the clear and knowing nature of our mind from that's the way that they articulate the conventional nature of mind. Yeah, I don't know. That's probably enough for now, because I don't know this topic like in and out in a very, very deep way to be able to articulate it to give you a more simple, succinct answer. So, but hopefully it's an interesting topic with Buddha nature. Is there anything? Yes, Jai, so you have your hand up as well, I see now.
Jay, you need to unmute.
Apologies. Thank you. I
Yeah.
previously talked to Losang Dundrup about this, and it's still something that I ponder when we talk about bodhicitta, that it amazes me that I will often encounter situations in Buddhist centers where I feel like I have this idea that if you're really focusing on compassion, and which we do so much, that then aren't you compassionate toward others, is the question that comes up for me. And then I run into situations where people don't look particularly friendly or kind, and I kind of find that, hang on, that seems to go totally against what we're supposed to be doing here. So I don't know how to integrate that. Is that a clear question? It's like, doesn't bodhicitta make you, and spending all this time doing all of this, doesn't it make you then be actually more compassionate in the world, where it's more than just sort of wanting somebody, having the intention that we all, get out of samsara, fabulous. Mm-hmm. But meanwhile, doesn't that impact on your behavior and how you interact with people? Or am I just being naive?
I think ideally it does. I mean, it's a tricky line to walk. We don't, on the one hand, we don't necessarily know how each and every other person that we're going to encounter, how their activity of wanting to alleviate the suffering and its causes from others would look like. There's clear ways that just don't work socially and culturally, I mean, and we can get to this a little bit later, like things like harsh speech, somebody that is consistently always, speaking in a way that is harmful or hurtful to people. Like it's a stretch to call that sort of thing a compassionate activity, right? The challenge, I think, is, yes, these practices are supposed to produce this result. There's a couple things running through my mind on the, this is supposed to be small scope, and that compassion stuff is kind of a later activity. But when we can't expect people to have perfect realizations. And even if somebody has committed to practicing the Dharma for a long time, it doesn't mean that they're going to always have a easy, like perfect, kind of clear, open countenance, for example, right? Like their facial expression could be one that's stern, or or their mannerisms. But no, the question is, they can still be actually working on it, or maybe they're working on something else. But if they're working on generating compassion, if they're actually like doing the practices that will bring about that result, then we get to trust that over time that is going to actually work,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And also, like, what sorts of things am I able to do? Like, what sort of interactions can I have with this person that might actually bring about that result too, right? This is tricky because I want people to be careful of trying to go around and fix everybody else. That becomes really problematic for me. But the Dharma offers a different way of being able to engage somebody without trying to do anything to them, that opens up space, that allows them to be as they are, kind of unconditionally, in the future, perhaps unconditionally. And sometimes just that spaciousness that people can experience is enough to help relax their minds and to help them be able to cultivate the qualities that you wish they would, compassion, for example.
Yep.
I don't know. I mean, I'm wandering around a little bit.
Well, I'll tell you my takeaway. Yeah.
Please.
Which is, I do, I'm the kind of person who does a lot of self-examination, and certainly I have a critical judgmental streak. Yeah.
Me too.
And so, yeah, I do have certain expectations. By the way, an aside, I'm quite spoiled because I've worked in palliative care and been surrounded by very, very kind people.
Yeah.
A couple exceptions, which were shocking, but generally the majority. Yeah. So my takeaway from this is, like, my obligation for myself that I take on is that I need to treat people kindly. Yeah. And to set aside my judgmentalness. And as you say, in a sense, you don't know what's going on with folks, really. Yeah. And so I need to just not have a prejudgment about how I think someone should be, just because they're in a Buddhist center and have been for years. Yeah. So that's my takeaway on that one for me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. And I'm one who's often careful with my expectations, because I find that they create a lot of suffering for myself. You can have I'll have aspirations, or but for me, that language, like the energy around expectation, is a little bit like tighter and like harder. And it's not quite as fluid. And I think by doing what you're articulating, you know, which is like opening up and allowing them to have whatever experience it is that they're having, is actually a compassionate response, right? So it's one way of, I mean, it's relatively subtle, but if we come in with the negative judgment about somebody else, the way they tie their shoes or the way that they're manifesting absence of compassion or the negation of compassion, then I don't know, that may not actually alleviate their suffering. It may actually hinder that. So explore that a little bit. See.
I will. Thank you. That's
Great. Thanks.
helpful.
So the other aspect that I wanted to do with the approach to the small scope teachings is to maybe initially we can look at the result or the description of the result of the practice, and then see how the practices actually may bring that about, right? And this is kind of like grabbing a cookbook off the shelf, flipping through and looking for a picture or some words, you know, super awesome chocolate cake or something like that. You know, it's like, oh, we're examining, we're looking through the cookbook and we find something we find the result that we want, right? Which is this particular dish or this particular, you know, treat. And then we go into looking at what are the actual ingredients? Do I have all of them available? Do I have the type of stove that's needed? Do I have the dish, whatever it is, you know, and do I think that I can actually put all of this together, right? Oh, here are all the ingredients. I think I can do that. Oh, I've got this dish. It's going to work, you know, that's going to be great for holding the casserole or whatever it would be. And yeah, I think I understand the techniques that are articulated here, and I'm going to try it, right? And that trying of the recipe is the practice of Dharma. And if we want to affect the result of becoming a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings, to take the great scope motivation, then we look at all of the ingredients for that. And we say, oh, okay, here's an ingredient. Now here's this process where I need to, you know, crack open the eggs and put them in the bowl and then whip them up. And it needs to be at a particular, I'm not a chef, so I can't give you chef precision with the example here, but you guys get the sense. You've probably done enough things in your life where it's like, yeah, there's a process to it. And if you can integrate the process in a really nice way, then the result is what you're looking for. You know, making coffee is kind of a good example, because trying to make coffee well is like requires a bunch of activity, right? You know, there's a bunch of steps. You have to get the water temperature right. You have to get the grind right for the medium that you're brewing in, and same with tea. Or I'm sure it's the same with brewing beer or something. I don't know. I don't do any of that stuff, but I think you get the point. So if we, in this first section of the course, if we can look a little bit at what result is supposed to come from this, then our entry into looking at the topics and the practices of the topics may be a little different than if we were like, okay, here's the small scope, and the first part is precious human rebirth, and then you go through that. You know, I'm not trying to say one is better or worse than the other, but I think sometimes looking at the result can actually give us a little extra motivation, rather than being at the end of the book and realizing, oh, that's what was like, oh, that's the culmination here. So we're going to read the last chapter first, and then go back and try to understand the rest of the book from that perspective, if that makes any sense. So so with that, maybe I'll introduce the the way that the small scope, or the result that the small scope is supposed to affect. So one of the slight digression, one of the commentaries that I often use for studying the Lamrim is Yangtze Rinpoche's Practicing the Path. I'm also a big fan of Geshe Silpa's Steps on the Path to Enlightenment. That's a 5-volume commentary on the Lamrim Genmo. I'm sure there are others that are out there. I believe Pabanka Rinpoche's Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand is also a commentary on Lamrim Genmo. And there may be others that are, I don't know if Geshe Sherpa uses one in particular, or gives his own commentary on it. I'm sure he gives his own commentary. But some of the quotes I'll use will be drawn from Practicing the Path or the Steps in the Path to Enlightenment. They're both great from my perspective. So Yangtze Rinpoche says the path and practices of the small scope are based on the practices that seek to eliminate the mentality that grasps at the appearances of this lifetime, and cultivate the mentality that seeks benefit of future lifetimes. So that's kind of the framework. Lama Tsongkhapa. So as I was mentioning before, in the Lamrim, you can actually find the result that is supposed to be generated. So there's the mind that's supposed to arise through the particular practices. So Lama Tsongkhapa says, this is in volume 1 of the Lamrim Genmo. He says, previously you've had an uncontrived interest in this life, while your interest in future lives has merely been an understanding that follows what others say. You have generated the attitude of a person of small capacity when these interests change places, and your interest in the future has become paramount, while your interest in this life has become merely incidental. However, you must make your attitude stable. Thus, once it has occurred, cultivate it diligently. So there's a bit of information in there. One of the things Lama Tsongkhapa is saying is, by and large, throughout this lifetime, our activity has all been to support our experience of happiness and pleasure in this lifetime, right? That's been the primary motivator for our activities. But through the practices of the small scope, or primary motivator is the experience in this life, right? So the pleasure that we experience, the happiness that we experience, but we have very little concern about what happens in the future for us, the long-term next lifetime future. For Westerners, again, that's like, we have operated probably through most of our life without having awareness of future lifetimes. So, but for Lama Tsongkhapa's time, the idea of future lives was very common. It was just the worldview that they had. So we can move through the practices in the small scope, we can move from being concerned just with what's happening in this life to what our future lives are going to be like. And for us, there's a couple important questions around that. One of them is like, well, do I believe in future lifetimes? If I do, then great, that's integrated. If I don't, that's okay. A side question to that might be, what would it take for me to believe in future lifetimes? What sort of evidence would I need? Do I consider it even a possibility, or is it like, no, that's just mumbo jumbo? If we do believe, or we're inclined to believe, or we might allow the possibility of future lifetimes, what would it take to generate the interest in cultivating a good future rebirth? For me personally, what is it that I need to be aware of, to have at my disposal, or what have you, to really be interested in having a future rebirth that is beneficial? So how do we get the interest in our life, or our future life, to be paramount? Like, why, so that's one one sort of question that I think is really important. Another side question that will actually hopefully we'll be able to integrate this throughout. How does future rebirth actually help us with gaining liberation from samsara or becoming a Buddha? How do the specific practices of the small scope that generate this wish to, or not generate the wish, but to turn our mind to our future rebirths, how will they actually impact the later practices in the Lamrim? So we can actually have all of that integrated. Any thoughts of those sorts of comments? Or yes, Aaron.
Is it emptiness? Is that the key to it? Meditating on emptiness? Because the idea is that emptiness is what enables us to not be attached to to the temporal things.
Yeah, that's a great question. The topic of emptiness is not discussed in the small scope section of the Lamrim. It's actually a little bit more basic. The topic of emptiness really is discussed in the Great Scope section. I mean, in part the medium scope, because an awareness of emptiness is how we get liberated from samsara. But there's a whole chapter on wisdom in the Lamrim Genmo that's later. So the brief answer for the small scope is no, it's not. Emptiness is actually integrated into the worldview, but that's not how we get this reprioritization of future lifetimes versus this lifetime in the small scope. Yeah. Yes, Jai.
Thank you. So when I hear the word belief in Buddhism, I get confused because I go back to, and this I would have heard her articulate ages ago, Rabina Curtin saying, Buddha didn't teach a religion. It was actually what he suggested was, try this out and see if it works for you. All right. And so I have working hypotheses. I don't believe in really anything. I have one experience of that. I think that human beings have a divine nature that I've had like a direct experience of is what it felt like. Yeah, I could be wrong, but that's what it felt like. The rest of it, I'm quite happy to hold hypotheses, and certainly karma. Yep. Possibility that there is another life after this one, I can hold that. But when I hear the word belief in Buddhism, I get very confused. So can you talk about that a bit for me? Thank you.
Yeah, can you give me an example of belief? I don't remember whether I said belief in this or not.
Yes, sir, you did. You definitely did use the word believe, because I, kind of like things go off in my head like doorbells when I hear that, and I go, what's happening? Yeah. So, Shayla, did you? I mean, I don't have a memory of anything particularly because that's part of my problem in life right now.
Yeah.
But just I think you talked about belief. If you have a belief in karma, have a belief in afterlife or in migration, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that the tradition will say is that awareness is, this is me ad-libbing a little bit. One of the things that the tradition really wants us to do is to generate awarenesses that actually confirm what is articulated conceptually in the tradition. Yep. So that is the really what the goal is, right? That's the purpose of studying. It's to eventually develop the realization, the deep, profound awareness that this is X, Y, or Z, right? The tradition offers lots of arguments that then support those perspectives. I mean, for example, Shakyamuni Buddha practiced with other meditation practitioners for a very long time, went through tremendous austerities. He was looking for a way out of suffering and didn't find it.
Mm-hmm.
But then he cultivated this strong resolve and sat under the Bodhi tree and then was enlightened. That's the story we have, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the enlightenment was this profound sort of realization, right? He initially didn't even want to talk about it.
Yep.
Because people wouldn't believe what he was going to say. Right? I mean, that's the way the tradition talks. That's part of the story that we have. He's like, I can't I don't want to speak for Shakyamuni Buddha, believe me. We can imagine them saying, like, I'm not sure how people can integrate this, what I'm going to say about this, because it's actually beyond the bounds of conceptuality. Yep. Right?
Mm-hmm.
All of the teachings in the Lamrim are to help us. They can be provisional beliefs, they can be conceptual understandings. Then our responsibility is to do the contemplations, to reflect on them, to see that it makes sense, or no, it doesn't. And then if it doesn't, you keep working or you discard. But then to meditate on it. So this is how the tradition talks about the three wisdoms: the wisdom of hearing, the wisdom of contemplation, and the wisdom of meditation. The wisdom of hearing is simply like I was saying in the example, we can read the Lamrim and we can memorize it. And we could actually have like, okay, those are what all of the words are. And then we get into the level of meaning, and we get clearer and clearer on that through contemplating it, through discussion, through having our teachers illuminate various aspects. And then there's a conceptual understanding of it, right? And then we can say, I believe that, or I don't believe that, right? And on the conceptual level. Okay. But then there's the meditative level, right? So we could understand conceptually what having limitless compassion would be. Like completely, we can understand conceptually that there's compassion that wishes to liberate every sentient being from suffering, every single type of suffering in every instance. Like that's an idea we can have in our head. But very few of us have a heart that actually recognizes that realizes that can operate from that, right? But believing that that's possible, I think, is pretty essential. It's pretty important, So I'm partly highlighting this difference between a conceptual belief and a conceptual understanding and assenting to something, because it makes sense and the logic is there. But then also having a realization, what the tradition would talk about is like a realization, or some like a profound awareness, maybe akin to what you were talking about with the spiritual experience, So I'm using belief in the sense that this could be a conceptual belief or a conceptual understanding. I'm understanding that the tradition is articulating this, and there is a pathway to having a realization of that.
Yep. Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of like relax the belief response a little bit, because, I mean, that's the point is the point isn't to espouse some philosophical perspective because it's going to give somebody a bunch of power. The point is to help each and every one of us move out of the ways that we limit, that we truncate, that we constrain our own way of seeing and a way of engaging with everything that exists.
Yep. Okay. Yep, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Ta. Thank you.
Aaron, is there something else you'd like to share?
Yes, I was thinking that, I remember Dharma Kurti also pointed to like a reliabilist way of thinking about it too, that we focus on those cognitions that reliably produce truth. So we're open to it, to the possibility of things like rebirth and so on, and like the other realms. But because we focus on the practices at work, we reliably assert like that belief and then later focus on the insight of them.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's another aspect of, a technical approach. Another one that comes to mind in these kinds of conversations is there are different types of doubt, right? We can have a doubt that says absolutely not, no way possible. That's just not, not going to happen. We can have a doubt that is inclining towards not so much, not really possible. We can have a doubt that is actually inclining towards the belief, right? So there's different ways of seeing the way that the mind is relating to or reacting to a particular idea. And I think it can be helpful to, like I said, like allow these things to come and set on the table, where there's more of a neutral perspective on them. We don't necessarily have to ascribe to them, and we don't necessarily have to reject them and say absolutely not, right? And this is kind of practical because when we can think about it intellectually and we can think about it emotionally. When we say absolutely not, we can sense the way that we're closed off to something. And the ability for like the potential for growth in that it's just limited, right? It's like, oh, well, you can talk with somebody who's addicted to X, Y, or Z. And if they are not if they're not really clear that this is destroying their life, for, to use an extreme example, I'm using an example like my partner is in CPE right now, and they were in conversation with somebody who's been a heroin addict for, over 30 years, right? And they're still like, I love drugs, but if I do drugs anymore, I'm going to kill myself. Like their body is literally in a place where it's going to shut down, right? So they've got to find this line where they're committing to abstaining from that. I don't know how, this is a weird example to bring up. It's just what came to mind. They're abstaining from that, but they still have like a wish to participate in it, right? It's an interesting situation for them to be in. So I guess the point is, whenever we come up against things that we hear about in the Dharma, we can have a variety of responses. And one of the responses that I advocate is, if naturally it's like, no, there's resistance or aversion or shutting down, I encourage us to maybe cultivate a little bit of openness and say, okay, I'm not ready to ascribe to that right now, but I also am curious how it functions. How does that idea function in the rest of the teachings? How does that idea function in relation to the other practices? And here's the side question, like, what would it actually take for me to believe that? I don't believe it right now. And sometimes we come up with these responses without actually understanding why we don't believe them, right? But if we can get clear on why I don't believe it, then either we're stepping into a more integrated position then, right? Rather than just this gut reaction, like, no, that's not for me. It's like, oh, that's not really for me because of this, this, and this. But, the tradition says this. I can maybe be curious about why they're saying it or what the perspective is that gives rise to that viewpoint. And then how is it actually useful in what the tradition is doing? How is having some, like, how is leaving the idea or the possibility of rebirth on the table helpful in generating the realizations of the small scope, right? How is that helpful? It seems pretty integral for Lama Tsongkhapa's way of articulating it. You know, your interest in the future lifetime has become paramount, right? That's pretty important. But it's, you know, so we can have that on the table, and then we can also still look into the teachings on the various topics and see, like, oh, even if I don't believe that, is there something I can take now from this other type of teaching, or this teaching, for example, on precious human rebirth? So that's part of my hope. So in the small scope itself, there are arguably 4 different topics. The first one is usually categorized as precious human rebirth. The second is considered impermanence and death. The third is refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And the fourth is karma, or looking at cause and effect. So each of these topics, precious human rebirth, impermanence and death, taking refuge, and reflecting on karma, is supposed to affect this switch from concern in this lifetime alone to our concern for future lifetimes. Or if we're a practitioner of the medium scope, it's supposed to help prepare our minds to want not just a better rebirth, but to then become liberated from samsara altogether. The teachings on precious human rebirth, impermanence and death, taking refuge, and karma for the great scope are to help us to be able to generate those realizations in the great scope. They're meant to help us to be able to have a deeper awareness of suffering, so we can have an easier time generating loving kindness for all sentient beings and compassion, which is the foundation of bodhicitta. Bodhicitta as the wish to attain enlightenment for the benefit of sentient beings. So what we get to do is explore a little bit here and see what's in precious human rebirth and how can it help us see this result of concern for future lifetimes. What's in impermanence and death, how does that fit in helping us generate this concern for future lifetimes? Same with refuge. How does refuge help us? How does thinking of karma help us ensure that we can have a better rebirth? So we have about 15 minutes left here. I'm contemplating, like, time-wise, which direction do we end up going? I think maybe it'd be good for let's do a little meditation to come back to one of the things I was talking about, which is like connecting with our personal motivation and reflecting on or connecting with what result are we looking for in this in this practice, in this short course that we're going to engage in. So, I think to begin, if we have any particular close association with a teacher, we could bring that to mind. If there's no particular association with a teacher, you can perhaps imagine Shakyamuni Buddha. In keeping that connection with your teacher, with Shakyamuni Buddha, you can bring to mind what initially drew you to Buddhist practice or to study of Buddhism. And you can reflect on the sort of steps you've taken since that time. Some of the practices you've engaged in. Some of the highlights of those practices. And you can bring to mind some aspect of your Dharma path or your spiritual path. Well, there's still some gaps. There's some aspect you want to bolster, support, to clarify. And we can generate a motivation to do exactly that. And hopefully there's some connection with that, with the small scope, with deepening our awareness of precious human rebirth, impermanence and death, refuge and karma. And perhaps we can make that connection more clear in our minds. So we can say, here today, this is my working motivation, my working aspiration. For my activity in this short course. And we can place that in the greater context of our entire spiritual path. We can see it as a specific step to our highest spiritual goals. You can look at that either through a visualization, so you can imagine it being literally a stone on a path, or a town on a road, or you can imagine it more kinesthetically, where you're actually moving. These activities are moving you on the path to your highest spiritual aspirations. So each of our thoughts, our questions, all of our engagement with the small scope here, we realize as integrated in our spiritual path. And we can remember our teacher is accompanying us all the way. And gently we can kind of release that visualization. Come back to more normal discourse. Is there anything you'd like to share about that way of trying to integrate what we may be doing here to the big picture? Yes, Victor.
Well, thank you, Daryl. I've just been listening, and you made some things clear tonight for me in terms of the path or the scopes. That was one of the main difficulty when I first started was it seems like it was overwhelming and it's overlapping, and to break it down, I mean, figure out a way to figure it out. And you did break it down. So I thank you. And it's still a working process. I have to keep thinking about it. But it's the first time I hear about the wisdom, the three wisdom. I only got the first or second. Can you just briefly tell me the three once again, and I'll write it down?
Yeah. This is a common way the tradition will talk about the wisdom of hearing,
Okay.
the wisdom of contemplation,
Okay.
and the wisdom of meditation.
Okay. All right. I got it. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Anything else? We have just a couple minutes and then we get to do some prayers. So I think in the next session, the next three sessions, we'll dig into the topics a little bit. And I'd like us to keep our connection with our motivation, and it may shift or it may develop. Just stay connected with that. And also maybe keep an eye out for how can this particular teaching help me now, even if I'm not bought into the full Buddhist view completely. So that will be beneficial. I haven't been able to do it yet, but I can scan a section of the Lamrim Genmo, where Lama Tsongkhapa talks about how the three scopes are integrated. I think that'll be a helpful thing just to have in mind. And then if you have access to one of the commentaries on the sections on precious human rebirth and death and impermanence, it'll be helpful. And I can also put out some notes, or I don't know, Venerable Dundrup, if the center has anything on the meditation on death, particularly the 3 roots, 9 reasonings, and 3 conclusions. Death is certain, etc. If you guys have like a small thing on that, that would be something that would be good for people to be able to look at. I think it's a useful tool to have for this. So
we'll put a class materials link on the event page, so you can just check back.
Okay, great. Excellent. Is there anything more anybody would like to say or share? Or?
Just thank you. It's been very helpful. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate the conversation. It's nice you've been asking good questions, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to figure some things out together in this process. So, well, that said, we can maybe bring up some prayers, and we'll do our final dedication. So once again, bringing back to mind your particular teacher, if you have a heart teacher or Shakyamuni Buddha, and we can imagine all of the other teachers around them, and we can imagine all sentient beings as well, as we do this sort of dedication. So, due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that is not arisen arise and grow. May that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplished magnificent prayers, honoring the 3 jewels, Savior, myself, and others, your disciples, please, please live long. the wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors, for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. Beloved teacher, leading your students toward wisdom and compassion, explaining through exacting discernment the steps of the graduated path, you who are the unequaled guide, please live a long and stable life. So thank you all once again for your time and energy. May you all have long and stable lives where you're able to engage the Dharma exactly in ways that will be most efficacious for you. So
Thank you. Great class.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.